Alright, so I just built this microphone rig and I was going to make a video of it, but it was kind of terrible. So this is now going to be my first video, the introduction, the who am I, etc. And as you can see behind me, a bunch of miscellaneous junk, which is much like what I do. I take a bunch of miscellaneous junk and I make something. Like, got some robots from Goodwill, or I got some RC cars from Goodwill, and I made some robots out of them. And yeah, so this is Gatorbot, and he's got a Pi Zero in him and a really lousy but totally functional L298N motor controller, which is able to control two motors in forward or backward at the same time. And that's all just stuffed inside of this thing. And then I've got the batteries for the speaker and the my words have been forgotten. But the batteries that control it up in here. And of course it has a speaker. And then in terms of it being driven around on the internet, which is what I do. The thing I do with these robots is I host them on Let'sRobot.tv, which is also the logo around the edges of the video that I've stretched to make it fit. There's this website, Let'sRobot.tv, where people can just host robots, and the way it works is you put a webcam and a Raspberry Pi or whatever other device you have, usually just a Raspberry Pi though, on your robot, and let that control it, and people on the internet can then log in to this website, see it, and drive it around, which is pretty cool. And I first got interested in that like a year and a half ago, and at the time it seemed super unfeasible because all the kits on that website were over $100, and I have very little money. But then I started getting into actually working with Raspberry Pis, and I got myself these cheap little motor controllers, and I realized I don't need the $100 super gearbox motor. I can just use the little yellow ones that you get with certain robotics kits that are like $1 or $2 each. Those work fine for driving around something, or what I've been doing, what actually is being driven around on the internet whenever I'm hosting them, is RC cars from Goodwill. Much like this guy that I'm currently working on, you can see there's a Pi Zero embedded right here, and a little L298N motor controller right here. And these 4 pins that you can probably only barely see that don't have anything on them yet, those are going to go to the motors. There's 2 pins for each motor, for the 2 wires on each motor. And then the battery connectors are going to come out of the top. There's a screw here, and this is a battery cover, and usually there'd be some double A's inside there, but since I'm not going to be driving it off that, that's just where I threaded the wires through. And then that sits on top of the body of this little robot, which I call tank style, because both of the wheels on each side are fused, so it drives like a tank versus like most RC cars where you have a steering mechanism, which is way easier if you're going to have, say, a large delay time on your driving, or if you just want to run some really simple code to drive a robot. It's much easier to control just 2 motors and setting their speeds and directions to drive a robot. And so basically I'll just go to Goodwill and I'll pick up some robots, or some RC cars that look like they'd make good robots, tear them apart, take out all the stuff inside, see if any of it's still useful. Most of the times it's not, but I've been saving like the little controller boards out of these little tanky RC cars, because they do have motor driver chips on them, and if I ever somehow run out of the cheap little motor controller boards that I use, I might try soldering some of those onto something and using that, which is probably a terrible idea, but yeah, we'll see what happens. But so I've built robots like, this is the top half of SonicBot, or SanicBot as I renamed him when I built him this thing as sort of a Halloween costume slash decoration thing for the rest of all time. And he's got LEDs and speakers embedded in the top, and this wire dangling out is the speaker wire that hooks onto the Pi. And he's real fancy. And then his body, the lower half of him, is here, it's this setup here with all the stuff dangling off of it. It looks great. It's so well made. But you've got your... You had your battery pack that was glued on there briefly, but apparently couldn't take a steep angle. You got your Raspberry Pi. You got an L298N motor controller. There's a switch in there for controlling power to the motor. The batteries that drove the motors are under here. This guy is obviously out of commission right now. I took his webcam to film these videos with. But he's only one of many robots. I've got Gatorbot here. He's based on the same little tanky RC car design. There are a bunch that look very similar, but obviously have different aesthetic on top of them. And I've wired him up with some fancy speakers. Then this button is the power button for those speakers. And then there's just this nice, juicy battery pack on the back of him. And that's what drives the whole thing. And of course, there's a Pi Zero deep inside of his mouth zone. And then I've got my biggest robot, which I still need to work on to make it drivable again, is Tankbot. And he's a 1/16 scale tank that I found on Goodwill for like $3. Like, ridiculous. This thing was worth... It was from Toys R Us before Toys R Us shut down, rest in peace. And it would have been like $150 for this amazing little RC tank. And I've cannibalized it and stuffed a Raspberry Pi inside this loose top half here. And of course there's a camera on the front there that you can see. It's a Logitech whatever. Batteries go in the bottom like any RC car. And it would drive around. And it worked pretty well. I just need to... I took it apart and reworked how I was going to have the motor controllers in there. Because I have a couple different types. I have the fancy Adafruit brand Raspberry Pi motor controller things. But those don't allow for very much additional use. They take up the whole GPIO of the Raspberry Pi. They take up all of these pins, even though it only needs like 8 of them to function. Yeah. And do I have anything else to show? I have no idea. I'll probably become more competent in making videos as I make videos. Hopefully. Yeah. And I'll probably edit out all of the times when I went, and possibly put a compilation of those right about now. Oh yeah, and I'll see you guys next time.